It was a gray, rain-swept afternoon at the Polaris Club, the kind of place where every polished fork had a purpose and silence was dressed in medals. The room breathed prestige, oil portraits of admirals watched over each corner, and conversations floated gently beneath crystal lighting. Somewhere between the clink of water glasses and the weight of decorated uniforms stood Lily Parker, her posture straight but her presence barely noticed. In her black vest and starched shirt, she adjusted a tray with trembling hands, doing everything she could not to draw attention. She had only been working here for 3 weeks, always stationed near the kitchen doors, unseen, unheard, and perfectly replaceable. But that afternoon, something or someone would tilt the balance. One quiet gesture would bring a decorated war hero to tears and remind a forgotten woman what it meant to be seen. Lily had always understood silence. It had cradled her, shaped her, and in many ways, protected her. Raised by her grandfather, a deaf Navy veteran, she learned to speak not with her voice, but with her hands. Long before uniforms and admirals filled her world, her evenings were spent signing bedtime stories, prayers, and "I love you" in a language built on touch and trust. That sacred skill became her comfort, her connection, and her quiet rebellion against the noise of everything she couldn't control. The Polaris Club, with its velvet curtains and polished brass, was the furthest thing from that quiet world. Here, rank ruled every room, and every word spoken was as formal as a command. That day, Table 4 had been reserved for Admiral Henry Otero, a man whose reputation filled rooms long before he entered them, and his mother, Margaret James, a woman known more for her silence than her lineage. As Lily approached the table with the practiced grace of someone hoping not to be noticed, she paused. Margaret was smiling politely, but her eyes were flicking between lips, not words. Then Lily saw it, just beneath a careful wave of silver hair, a discreet hearing aid, almost hidden. And the way the Admiral leaned close to speak, not out of affection, but habit. She took a breath, slow, steady, and raised her hands. Before we continue, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more exciting stories that you won't want to miss. The tray in Lily's hands felt heavier as she stepped toward Table 4, her fingers curled tightly around the rim. Margaret James sat upright in her chair, hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture noble but gentle. The delicate green of her dress mirrored the calmness in her expression, but her eyes held something else, a quiet search, a reaching. Her smile never wavered, but it didn't reach her eyes, not fully. She nodded at her son's words, but Lily could see it. She wasn't hearing them. She was reading lips and barely keeping up. Admiral Henry Otero sat across from her, unmoving, a figure carved from tradition and command. His white uniform was immaculate, rows of ribbons and insignia stitched with precision across his chest. He leaned toward his mother occasionally, repeating phrases just a little slower, but his gaze stayed on the menu, on the staff, on everything else. He wasn't unkind, just used to distance, the way some people wore strength like a uniform long after they'd taken it off. His jaw was set, and though he never raised his voice, something about him silenced the room. Lily had never seen anyone demand that much space without saying a word. She stopped at the side of the table, smoothing her apron and steadying her breath, but her eyes stayed fixed on Margaret. The woman looked at her now, not like a guest assessing staff, but with the warm attention of someone who noticed others because she so often went unnoticed herself. The hearing aid was barely visible, tucked just beneath the elegant wave of silver blonde hair. Lily didn't plan it, didn't rehearse it. But something in her chest tightened, not with fear this time, but memory, and her hands began to rise. She signed, slowly and clearly, "Would you prefer water or tea, ma'am?" Margaret gasped, the reaction as swift as it was silent. Her hand flew to her chest, eyes wide, and then glassy with sudden emotion. Her lips parted in disbelief as she stared at Lily, not at the tray, not at the uniform, but at her hands. She didn't respond at first. She simply blinked, as though the air itself had shifted. And then she signed back, her fingers trembling. "You know sign?" Lily nodded. The movement was subtle, but her throat was tight with the weight of what this moment meant to both of them. The Admiral had looked up from the menu now, eyebrows raised, the tension in his face disrupted by confusion. He watched his mother's hands move, watched the lightness in her expression, and then turned his eyes to Lily. For the first time, his attention wasn't distant or procedural. It was personal. Margaret let out a laugh, not loud, not disruptive, but real. It rippled through her whole frame like something rediscovered, the kind of laugh that hadn't been heard in a while. She turned to her son and signed something, quickly and excitedly. He didn't catch it. Lily, however, did and translated without being asked. She said, "She speaks with her hands." Like we used to. The Admiral blinked, caught between recognition and something far less certain. For a man built of precision, this unstructured tenderness unsettled him. He turned his full attention to Lily now, and for a second, said nothing. Then, "Where did you learn?" Lily answered softly, still holding the tray, still standing. "My grandfather. He was deaf. Vietnam left him that way. Sign was how we talked, how I told him things when I didn't have the words." Margaret's hand touched her necklace, not as a habit, but as if steadying herself against a flood of feeling. Her smile returned, brighter this time, as she nodded slowly in understanding. Lily carefully poured the Admiral a glass of water, then turned to Margaret again. "Would you like tea or water?" she signed once more, this time with a gentler rhythm. "Tea," Margaret signed, her hands sure now. "With lemon." "Thank you." The Admiral looked between them, his mother's expression unfamiliar. Not because he hadn't seen her happy, but because this was something different. This was ease. Margaret wasn't guessing anymore, wasn't nodding through a fog of missed meanings. She was conversing fully, freely, and with someone who didn't treat it like a charity. Lily moved with more confidence now, setting their drinks down and offering a signed, "You're welcome." Other staff were beginning to take notice, pausing just slightly in their steps, trying to make sense of the dynamic unfolding at table 4. Lily didn't care. For the first time since she started this job, she wasn't performing a role. She was connecting. Margaret leaned forward slightly, catching Lily's gaze, then signed, "You're very kind." Lily smiled, her chest tight with a different kind of ache, one that remembered late nights and whispered signs with a grandfather who never heard her voice, but always heard her heart. "So are you," she signed back. The room, as formal as ever, seemed to grow warmer around them. Something had shifted, not just in posture, but in energy. The Admiral cleared his throat, not in warning, but in grounding. "I didn't expect this," he said, quieter than before. Lily offered only a respectful nod. "It's an honor, sir," she replied, and then turned back to Margaret with another small question in sign, this time about the appetizer menu. The conversation continued, unfolding like silk, gentle, smooth, and layered with things unspoken. Lily translated when needed, signed directly when possible, and listened without interruption. Margaret laughed twice more, full and open, the kind of laughter that made others at neighboring tables glance over with surprise. And every time she laughed, the Admiral shifted. Just slightly. Just enough for Lily to see it. He wasn't used to being surprised. He watched his mother light up in a way he hadn't seen in years, her hands dancing through the air, not with struggle, but with grace. Lily could feel his gaze moving between them, and she met it once, steady, respectful, and honest. Not challenging, just present. And for a man who'd spent decades commanding rooms and leading fleets, being present was something he hadn't had to do in a long, long time. The rest of the lunch was calm, but charged with something sacred. There was no announcement, no applause, just the kind of moment that echoes long after the room has emptied. When Lily stepped away to give them privacy, she heard Margaret's voice faint, but filled with awe. "She's like a memory," she whispered to her son, "but real." The Admiral didn't answer. Not yet. His eyes were still fixed on the spot where Lily had stood, where a waitress had walked up with a tray and left them with something far more powerful than service. The tea arrived with quiet grace, placed gently between porcelain and polished silver. Lily signed the choices for appetizers, gently raising her eyebrows at the mention of crab cakes, which made Margaret laugh. It wasn't just service now, it was conversation. A language once buried by silence now danced between them with familiarity. Margaret responded with lively gestures, asking about the soup with a smile that softened the lines of her face. Lily translated each menu item with clarity and care, shaping her hands into meaning and expression. Her fingers moved not just with function, but with warmth, a rhythm learned in childhood, tempered by memory. She added small asides, subtle jokes signed between menu options, and Margaret's eyes sparkled like glass catching sun. The Admiral didn't interrupt. He simply watched, first curious, then strangely still. Other guests had begun to notice. Not with stares or whispers, but with a strange hush, like something sacred was happening a few tables away. The hush spread quiet admiration from men and women who'd seen battles, boarded carriers, and delivered speeches, yet somehow had never seen this. A decorated officer's mother, once the silent companion at every function, was now radiant, fully present. And the one making that happen wasn't in uniform. She was a waitress with callous fingers and the language of love written into her hands. Margaret leaned forward slightly, signed a question, and Lily paused, then smiled. She asked how long I've known Sign. Lily explained softly, then turned to answer in gestures. Since I was 6. My grandfather, Navy, too, lost his hearing from an explosion overseas. Margaret's nod was slow, her fingers lifting to sign something tender in return. So it's your first language, she said. Lily hesitated, then nodded. In a way, yes, she signed. He raised me after my mom died. I learned to say I was scared, or tired, or loved, with these hands. We never needed much sound between us. Margaret's gaze warmed even further, her expression folding gently into understanding. It was not pity, but shared recognition, the kind only found in those who've lived through silence and still come out listening. The Admiral remained quiet, his utensils idle, his eyes fixed not on the food but on the space between the two women. He didn't interrupt, something unusual for a man whose world was built on structure and command. He studied Lily as if trying to decode something deeper than her gestures, like her presence itself was reshaping the atmosphere. Something tight in his jaw relaxed, just slightly. Something long buried was beginning to stir. Margaret reached across the table and lightly tapped Lily's wrist, then signed, "The world is so loud now, but none of it listens." The words struck deeper than intended. Lily blinked, then exhaled slowly, her hands moving with reverence. "That's why I always love sign," she replied. "It requires you to see the person in front of you. You can't fake attention." There was a pause, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Even the Admiral, for all his armor of discipline and distance, seemed caught in it. He leaned back in his chair, eyes down now, but his brow furrowed, not in frustration, but reflection. His fork hovered over his plate, then dropped silently to the edge. His hands remained on the table still. Lily turned to Margaret and asked if she wanted to see the dessert menu. She mimed sweetness with a playful smirk, and Margaret chuckled, signing back, "Only if there's chocolate." They laughed softly, almost conspiratorially, and Lily nodded before stepping away to retrieve the card. At a table just across the room, a major and his wife exchanged a quiet look. The wife whispered, "I didn't know she could smile like that," nodding gently toward Margaret. When Lily returned, Margaret took a breath and signed something more serious. People think being deaf is just quiet. But it's not. It's lonely. Lily's eyes softened, her shoulders dipping slightly as if those words mirrored her own life too closely. She nodded before replying in kind. "I know. That's why I always sign with both hands and my heart." The Admiral finally spoke. "He was Navy?" he asked. Lily turned to him, surprised by the shift in tone. She nodded. "Petty officer, first class. I was raised on stories of the ocean, but I never saw it until his funeral." Otero pressed his lips together, his voice rougher now. "My mother taught me sign when I was a boy," he said. "I haven't used it in years." The admission hung in the air, fragile and naked. Margaret turned her gaze to him, her smile still gentle, but shaded with sadness. She reached across the table, laying her hand on his briefly, a reminder that forgiveness needs no language. He didn't pull away. He simply stared down at their hands, the contrast of age and memory echoing through his silence. Lily signed again, this time to both of them. It's never too late to speak again. Even in silence. The Admiral looked up, not at her hands this time, but at her face. Really looked. And something behind his eyes cracked open, just enough for light to break through. The dessert was ordered, chocolate torte and vanilla ice cream, shared between mother and son. Lily placed the plate down, signing a cheeky "no judgment if you want another." Margaret signed back, "I won't tell if you don't." Their laughter met again, easy and unburdened. The Admiral allowed himself the smallest smile, not wide, not performative, but real. The table settled into peace, not the rigid quiet of military decorum, but the warm hush of belonging. Lily stepped back, just enough to give them space, but her presence still anchored the air around them. She'd done more than serve them lunch. She had built a bridge neither of them remembered they needed. Behind her, she heard a voice, one of the senior officers murmuring, "She should be training the rest of us." Another answered, "I'd pay to see the Admiral like this again." But Lily didn't turn around. Her eyes stayed on Margaret, who now signed a simple sentence that would live in Lily's heart forever. "Thank you for seeing me." And Lily signed back, "Thank you for letting me." In a world that's always rushing to speak, how often do we truly listen, not just with our ears, but with our presence? If this story touched you, subscribe to channel and tell us in the comments, who in your life taught you the value of silence, and what did it help you hear? The Admiral sat still, but his thoughts had already drifted far from the table. Margaret and Lily were laughing again, hands dancing in a language he once knew like breath. He watched, trying not to show what stirred beneath his composed exterior, but it was there, rising like an old tide. Every flick of his mother's fingers stirred a memory, one he had kept locked away behind medals and protocols. He took a slow sip of water, not for thirst, but to delay emotion. He was 8 the first time he saw his mother sign. Back then, the movements were clumsy, soft, his father called them hand chatter, teasing gently as Margaret practiced in the mirror. She had started losing her hearing gradually, a condition the doctors said would progress with time. At first, it was only missed words. Then it became missed conversations, then entire silences that stretched longer than she admitted. Young Henry had learned sign language before multiplication tables. He remembered sitting cross-legged on the living room rug, mimicking her motions, fingers stumbling but determined. She used to cup his cheeks in both hands and smile whenever he got a word right. It made him feel like he could move mountains with just his hands. For a while, it was theirs, a secret world of gestures and glances that no one else understood. But as he grew older, the silence grew heavier. He became embarrassed, not of her, but of how different she made the world feel. His friends at school didn't understand why his mother didn't speak much anymore. They asked questions. They stared. And somewhere along the way, he stopped answering them. By high school, he had almost entirely stopped signing. Margaret didn't say anything about it, just smiled, and watched him drift further from the language that once held them together. She adapted in other ways, reading lips, carrying small notebooks, smiling through miscommunications. And Henry buried the guilt beneath ambition. He joined the Navy at 17, craving order, clarity, and noise, anything but silence. The Navy rewarded his discipline. He climbed ranks quickly, earned respect, executed flawlessly. But in all that advancement, there was no room for soft spaces, no room for hands that spoke without sound. His world became one of briefings, reports, and salutes. Emotion was a liability. Memory, a distraction. Until now. He looked at Lily, still signing as she took Margaret's dessert order, and saw something he hadn't realized he was missing. Not just the language. The intimacy. The way his mother leaned forward, her shoulders loose, her joy unhidden. Lily wasn't just translating words. She was translating care. It struck him, deep and uncomfortably, that everything he had once shared with his mother had been waiting for him all along. He had turned away from it. And in doing so, he'd left her to find comfort in strangers. Yet he didn't feel angry. He felt humbled. He glanced down at his hands resting on the tablecloth, strong, precise, used to saluting, pointing, commanding. But now they felt clumsy, foreign. These hands had written orders, signed promotions, but not one word to the woman who gave him everything. He curled his fingers slowly, uncertain. Could he even remember? Across the table, Margaret caught his movement. Her expression softened, gently curious. Lily noticed too and paused, just for a second, giving him space without speaking. The Admiral inhaled deeply, then slowly extended one hand, shaky but deliberate. He signed one word, home. Margaret froze, lips parting just slightly. Her eyes filled faster than he expected. One trembling hand rose to her lips, the other covered his. And in that fragile pause, the Admiral felt something unravel, not broken, not lost, but undone. Like a knot inside his chest finally letting go. She signed back, "I never left." He didn't reply, not with words. Instead, he looked down and blinked hard, swallowing a knot that had nothing to do with food. He'd commanded warships and led thousands, but he hadn't sat across from his mother like this in over a decade. Not truly. Not fully. Lily had given them a moment no authority could manufacture. She moved quietly, almost reverently, to refill the Admiral's water, signing briefly to Margaret before stepping back. Otero turned slightly toward her. "Thank you," he said. Lily nodded softly, but her expression said she understood far more than just the words. He watched her walk toward the kitchen, then turned back to his mother. Her hands rested on the table now, fingers gently tracing invisible shapes, perhaps names, perhaps memories. He suddenly wished he had asked her more questions, back when she had all the answers. Before silence made everything seem too complicated. He thought of how many dinners had passed like formalities. How much they had both lost in translation. The room around them buzzed faintly, servers moved, silver clinked, distant conversations resumed. But table 4 felt still. Almost sacred. Like time itself had paused to listen. The Admiral exhaled again, this time slower. Margaret reached for his hand again and squeezed. It was small, light, but it grounded him. He hadn't been touched like that since he was a boy. Not in comfort. Not in wordless forgiveness. He realized, painfully, that she had never stopped waiting for him to speak again. Otero shifted in his chair, adjusting his cuffs, a habitual reflex when emotion threatened his posture. But he didn't break eye contact. He didn't retreat. Instead, he signed one more word, a name. Henry. Margaret smiled through her tears, her lips trembling. "You remember," she signed. It wasn't a question. It was an absolution. He gave a half nod. "I'm trying." Lily returned a moment later with their check in hand, placing it discreetly. Margaret signed that she would like to treat him this time, and Lily translated with a playful smile. "Your mother insists," she said, gently. Otero let out a soft, stunned laugh, short but genuine. "I'd lose that argument anyway," he replied. The Admiral stood, smoothing his jacket, suddenly aware of how loud silence had become inside him all these years. He looked at Lily, standing quietly beside the table now, eyes patient, posture straight. "You gave her back to me," he said, simply. Lily shook her head. "She was always here. You just needed someone to help you hear her again." As they made their way toward the exit, Margaret paused, turned, and signed a short farewell. "See you soon." Lily signed back, fingers gentle. "I'd like that." The Admiral watched them both, the quiet bridge between past and present, blood and empathy, silence and voice. And as the doors closed behind them, he whispered to himself, barely audible, "So would I." The tension that once cloaked table 4 had lifted, replaced by something lighter, not laughter alone, but belonging. Margaret was seated comfortably now, gesturing freely with her hands, her signs fluid and expressive, occasionally punctuated by soft chuckles that seemed to draw the very light toward her. Lily stood at a slight angle between the two, translating with ease, but never interrupting, her voice calm, her presence steady. Admiral Otero, jacket still perfect, but posture slightly relaxed, leaned in now, not to command, but to listen. What began as formality was becoming familiarity. Margaret signed something with a playful shake of her head, and Lily grinned as she interpreted. She says you used to sneak cookies before dinner and blame the dog. The Admiral blinked, then let out a quiet laugh that drew glances from a nearby table, not because of volume, but because he laughed. It was the kind of sound that didn't belong to the uniform, but to the man beneath it. That dog was a terrible alibi, he admitted, shaking his head. Their conversation meandered through stories like a river, sometimes deep, sometimes shallow, always moving. Margaret shared memories from when Henry was a boy, a scraped knee on a fishing dock, a Thanksgiving when he'd tried to cook and nearly set the oven on fire. Lily interpreted with care, but also with color, her fingers animated, her voice catching nuance and affection. The Admiral chimed in, correcting small details or denying the most embarrassing ones, though his smile betrayed him. For the first time in years, Margaret wasn't the silent guest or the overlooked elder. She was at the center, vibrant and heard. Lily noticed the way the room responded, too. Nearby officers who'd barely glanced their way earlier now watched in quiet wonder, not with judgment, but curiosity. A few servers slowed as they passed, trying not to stare as the Admiral laughed with a waitress and signed to his mother with hesitant but honest hands. It wasn't a performance. It was a reunion, and one that had nothing to do with medals or protocol. And though Lily kept her focus on the table, she could feel the shift ripple through the space around them. Margaret asked Lily about her family, and Lily hesitated for a breath before replying. I was raised by my grandfather. Navy vet. Lost his hearing in Vietnam. Margaret's face softened instantly, nodding as if she'd known all along. Lily added, he passed a few years ago. I haven't signed with anyone like this since. The Admiral looked up then, something new in his gaze, not just gratitude, but understanding. You two must have been close, he said. Lily nodded. He taught me how to listen when there was no sound. He said that was the kind of hearing that mattered most. Margaret reached across the table and gently touched Lily's hand, her expression full of something unspoken and deeply felt. He would be proud of you, she signed. Lily blinked quickly, caught off guard by how much that landed. Her chest tightened, not in pain, but in recognition, like something once buried had been touched by sunlight again. She smiled, shaky but sure, and signed back, thank you. That means more than you know. Otero watched it unfold, his mother's hand still resting atop Lily's, and for a man who'd always measured loyalty in ranks, this felt like a different kind of honor. They returned to lighter conversation, favorite meals, odd hotel guests, how Margaret still cheated at cards. Lily admitted she hadn't played cards in years, but her grandfather had taught her to shuffle perfectly at 9. Said every deck tells a story, she added with a laugh. Margaret tapped the table and signed, you're surrounded by stories. You just happen to read them with your hands. Otero raised an eyebrow, amused. She always did like to talk in riddles. After a moment, Otero asked a quieter question, not out of politeness, but genuine interest. Lily, what are your goals? Where do you want to go? The question hung in the air for a beat. Lily glanced down, then up again, a quiet sigh escaping before she spoke. I wanted to study special education. Maybe audiology. But college wasn't in the cards after my grandfather passed. Margaret reached again, not for sympathy, but solidarity. She touched her chest, then Lily's, and signed slowly, you're already doing more than most with degrees. The Admiral's eyes didn't waver. You ever think about trying again? Lily gave a soft smile. Every day. Just didn't think anyone else would believe in it. For the first time that afternoon, the table fell into a reflective silence. Not awkward, not empty, but full. Lily stepped aside briefly to refill water, giving them space, but neither mother nor son moved. They sat with that stillness between them, one born of shared stories and long-forgotten language. One created not by duty, but by presence. Margaret picked up her spoon, nudging the last of her dessert toward Lily. For you, she signed. Lily laughed. I couldn't possibly. Try stopping me, Margaret replied with a wink. Otero chuckled, pushing his own plate forward. I never win when she gets like this. The meal drew to a natural close, the plates nearly empty, the conversation far from it. Margaret leaned back, content, her fingers still lightly moving in her lap. Otero folded his napkin slowly, watching Lily with an expression softer than anyone in that dining room had ever seen on his face. The table had been more than a place to eat. It had become a space of repair. Lily gathered the dishes gently, careful not to break the rhythm they'd found. Margaret reached for her wrist one last time. "Don't stop signing," she said. "The world needs more voices like yours." Lily nodded, blinking back a warm tide. "And it needs more hearts like yours," she signed in reply. As the Admiral stood to leave, he turned to Lily. "Thank you for today." His voice was even, but his eyes carried the weight of something more personal. She dipped her head respectfully. "Thank you for letting me witness it." The three of them stood there a moment longer, each changed, each lighter than before. From a distance, a guest remarked to a staff member, "It's not often you see an admiral smiling at lunch." The staff member replied, "Not like that, anyway." But Lily didn't hear them. She was already resetting the table, not to erase the moment, but to honor it. The table might host others tomorrow. But today, it had held something rare, not just food and conversation, but forgiveness, hope, and a language that needed no sound. Sometimes the most meaningful conversations happen at tables we never expected to sit at. Has someone ever seen potential in you when you couldn't see it in yourself? Tell us in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us the quietest people often carry the loudest love. The dining room had mostly cleared, the low hum of conversation fading as uniforms disappeared through velvet-lined doors. Lily busied herself wiping down a nearby table, her movements practiced, but unusually stiff. Each clink of cutlery against china felt louder now, every footstep behind her a possible summons. She hadn't been called over yet, but she could feel it coming. Her pulse thudded softly beneath her collar, a quiet drumbeat of dread. She hadn't meant to overstep. The signs, the stories, the connection, it had all happened so naturally, but now the formality of the room was creeping back in. What if she'd broken some invisible rule? She'd laughed with an admiral. She'd touched his mother's hand. And now, without meaning to, she might have jeopardized the one place she felt safe. A voice, calm, low, unmistakable, called her name from behind. "Miss Parker." She turned sharply, tray still in her hand. Admiral Otero stood just beyond the archway, his posture straight, but his tone unreadable. "A moment, please?" She nodded, setting the tray down and wiping her hands before following him into the corridor. The hallway outside the dining room was dimmer, lined with framed portraits of past naval legends and founders of the Polaris Club. Lily's heart raced as she stepped into the space, the soft click of her shoes swallowed by the thick carpet beneath. The Admiral waited by the window, looking out toward the city skyline that blurred beneath gray clouds. He didn't speak right away, and the silence made her stomach tighten further. She stood at attention, hands clasped, bracing for the formality to return. "I owe you an apology," he said, still facing the window. Lily blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. "Sir?" she asked gently. He turned to her then, slower than usual, eyes softer than she expected. "For making you think you did anything wrong." Relief rushed through her so fast it almost made her knees weak. But she didn't speak, not yet. Otero gestured toward the bench beneath the window, and they sat, not as officer and server, but as two people caught in something much deeper. He looked at his hands for a long moment before speaking again. "You brought her back today," he said, voice low. "The part of her that's been missing since my father died." Lily swallowed hard, her fingers curling around the edge of the bench. "She never really left," she said softly. "She just needed someone to speak in her language again." Otero nodded slowly, his gaze far away. "I stopped speaking it," he admitted. "Not out of anger, just exhaustion." He paused, running a hand across his jaw, as though trying to smooth out the regret behind his words. "When I joined the Navy, I told myself I didn't have time to learn both worlds. Sound and silence. I chose the latter one." His voice caught slightly. "She never blamed me. Not once." Lily listened in silence, her own heart echoing with familiarity. She had made choices like that too, ones that looked like survival, but felt like leaving something behind. Otero shifted beside her, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "You reminded me how to listen again." His words didn't carry rank. They carried weight. He looked at her fully now, eyes steady but no longer shielded. "Thank you," he said. Not just for the service. Not just for the meal. But for the bridge, the one she had built between him and the woman who raised him. Lily nodded, unsure how to respond without tears pushing at the corners of her eyes. "I don't know what your plans are for tomorrow," he continued, "but my mother's already asked to see you again." Lily's breath caught, then released in a small, surprised smile. "I'd be honored," she said. "Then come back. No tray. No uniform if you don't want it. Just come." The hallway was quiet, but the air between them buzzed with something unspoken. Respect, certainly. But more than that, recognition. Not as Admiral and Waitress, but as two people carrying silent burdens. She didn't need a title to know what this moment meant. "I've spent my life navigating by maps and orders," he said. "But you reminded me that some of the most important routes can't be charted." He stood then, as if the conversation had closed some long unspoken chapter in his heart. Lily stood with him, and for a moment, they shared a silence that needed no interpretation. As he walked her back toward the service corridor, the Admiral paused before parting. "Miss Parker," he said, "I think something important started today." His eyes narrowed just slightly, not with suspicion, but with resolve. "And I'd like to see where it leads." Lily met his gaze and replied with the only words she could trust in that moment, "So would I." She returned to the break room, her steps lighter but her mind spinning. There had been no reprimand. No lecture. Only honesty, something rare in rooms filled with rank and ritual. She sat on the bench by the lockers and breathed out slowly, hands in her lap, fingers twitching unconsciously in small signs of comfort. Outside, the rain had started again, soft, steady, rhythmic. A storm without violence. A sky rinsing itself clean. And for the first time in a long while, Lily felt like she had been seen not just for what she did, but for who she was. The next afternoon, the light that poured through the tall windows of the Polaris Club was softer, warmer, as though the storm had left a kind of quiet blessing behind. Lily arrived early, her hands folded before her apron, her hair pulled neatly back, but her heart moved with quiet anticipation. She had been asked not to bring her serving tray today, and that alone made the world feel slightly unreal. She wasn't here as staff, not exactly, she was here because someone wanted to see her. As she entered the private dining room, she found Margaret already there, seated near the window, a porcelain cup of tea before her. Margaret looked up immediately and smiled, the expression lighting her face like sunrise on calm water. She raised her hands and signed, "You came." Lily smiled, signing back, "Of course. I wouldn't miss it." Margaret gestured for her to sit, and Lily obeyed, folding her hands on her lap with a respectful stillness. For a moment, neither spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because they both knew that silence could hold more truth than words. Margaret reached across the table, her movements slow, graceful, deliberate. "My son told me about your grandfather," she signed, her eyes softening with the gravity of shared understanding. Lily nodded, her throat tightening slightly. "He was the best man I've ever known," she replied, her voice small but sure. "He couldn't hear my voice, but somehow he always heard me." Margaret's gaze deepened, touched by something ancient and tender. "My husband was like that," Margaret signed after a pause. "He was Navy, like Henry. Always at sea, always chasing the horizon. When he came home, he brought the ocean with him, its calm and its storms." Her hands slowed as she continued. When he passed, the silence was louder than anything. Lily's breath caught as she watched the older woman's fingers tremble slightly between phrases. It wasn't the fragility of age, it was memory. Lily hesitated, then lifted her own hands. "My grandfather was the same," she signed, her motions steady despite the ache behind them. "He told stories through gestures when words became too hard. Even when the world stopped listening, I still understood him." Her eyes glistened, not from sorrow, but from the deep recognition of being understood. Margaret smiled faintly, nodding in rhythm with the shared ache. They sat that way for a long moment, two women from different generations, two lives stitched together by loss and language. Between them lay decades of unspoken grief, yet somehow it didn't feel heavy. It felt gentle, like the tide had come in, washing away loneliness, but leaving memory intact. Lily realized then that grief didn't fade, it changed its shape until it became something you could hold. Margaret gestured toward the window, where the harbor gleamed faintly in the distance. The sea remembers, she signed. It carries everything, the laughter, the goodbyes, even the promises we never said aloud. Lily followed her gaze, thinking of her grandfather's stories about the Navy, about men who sailed into danger with songs and silence alike. He used to say the ocean speaks to those who've learned to listen, Lily murmured. I never understood it until now. Margaret reached for her hand, and in that quiet, they both did. Lily noticed then that Margaret's other hand was clutching something small, wrapped in blue velvet. The older woman hesitated before setting it gently on the table. This belonged to my husband, she signed. He wore it every day, even the day he went down in the Atlantic. Lily's eyes widened slightly as Margaret opened the cloth to reveal a silver navy pendant, its edges dulled by time but gleaming faintly under the sunlight. The engraving read, "To the waves that hold us all." Margaret slid it across the table, her fingers trembling just slightly. He gave it to me before his last voyage, she signed. Said it belonged with someone who understood what service meant, not just in uniform, but in heart. Lily stared at it, unable to speak for a moment, her breath caught between gratitude and disbelief. I can't, she whispered. This is too much. Margaret shook her head, her smile unwavering. You serve, too. Just differently. Tears welled up in Lily's eyes, quiet and unashamed. She lifted the pendant carefully, feeling its weight, not heavy, but grounding, as if carrying generations of courage. Her hands curled around it, pressing it against her chest. Thank you, she signed slowly, her fingers trembling. For trusting me with his memory. Margaret reached out again, resting her hand over Lily's, sealing the gesture with something deeper than words. Outside, the sunlight shifted again, scattering over the water like fragments of gold. It reflected off the pendant, off Margaret's eyes, off the fragile piece between them. Lily thought of her grandfather's old saying, every wave is a message from those we've loved. She wondered if he could see her now, sitting beside another soul who understood exactly what silence could mean. For the first time in years, she didn't feel small. She felt seen. Margaret leaned back, her breathing slow, her smile faint but full. You remind me of him, she signed. Not my husband, my younger self. Before the silence made me afraid. Lily's lips trembled into a smile, signing gently, you're still that woman. Margaret looked at her for a long moment, then laughed softly, a sound like wind through an open window. Maybe, she said, but it's been a long time since I believed that. Lily placed the pendant around her neck, the chain cool against her skin. Margaret's eyes shone as she nodded approvingly. It suits you, she signed. It looks like it was waiting. Lily brushed the pendant lightly, as if testing its reality. I'll take care of it, she whispered. Always. Their conversation drifted toward quieter places, memories of family dinners, small kindnesses, the funny ways people misunderstand silence. Margaret told a story of her husband trying to learn sign language during his final years, his hands clumsy, but his laughter unstoppable. Lily shared how her grandfather would sign jokes no one else would understand, then pretend to be offended when she didn't laugh fast enough. Between those stories, the room filled with a peace that felt like healing. When Lily stood to leave, Margaret signed one last phrase. The world may not always see you, Lily, but the right hearts will. Lily's throat tightened again, the pendant cool against her skin. I think I've already found one of them, she replied. Margaret's smile widened, and she reached up, signing, then promise me something. Lily tilted her head. Anything. Promise me you'll never stop using your hands for what they were made for, to build bridges, not walls. The words hung in the air, shimmering between them. Lily nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. I promise, she signed, her hands steady and sure. And in that shared silence, the promise felt eternal. As Lily stepped out of the dining room, the faint hum of conversation from the main hall faded behind her. She walked slowly through the corridor, the pendant resting close to her heart. The weight of it wasn't a burden, it was belonging. It was the soundless whisper of every person who had ever been unheard, carried forward through her hands. She realized then that she hadn't just been seen today, she'd been accepted. When she glanced back through the window, Margaret was still there, sipping her tea, sunlight painting her in gold. Lily smiled softly to herself, one hand pressed to the pendant. The sound of distant waves echoed faintly from the harbor outside, rhythmic and eternal. It was the sound of memory, the sound of love that never really leaves. The ballroom of the Polaris Club shimmered beneath golden chandeliers, its walls lined with naval flags and portraits of decorated heroes. Officers stood in pressed uniforms, their shoes gleaming like polished obsidian, their medals catching the light with every movement. The annual Navy Honor Banquet was normally a formal affair, a night of tradition, recognition, and reserved celebration. But this year, as the chatter faded and Admiral Henry Otero approached the podium, something in the air shifted. Not tighter, just quieter, as if the room instinctively knew that what was about to be said would break the mold. Otero stood straight, his posture crisp as ever, but there was a stillness to him now that didn't feel like command. It felt like purpose. He adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat gently, and began. "We gather here tonight to honor service," he said. But sometimes, the greatest service doesn't come from the field. It comes from the table next to you, from someone who sees what others miss. A murmur of curiosity rippled across the room. Most in attendance had heard whispers of something unusual that had happened in the private dining wing. But few knew the full story. And none expected the Admiral to address it now. "I'd like to tell you about a moment that changed me," he continued, voice measured but heavy with truth. He spoke plainly, not like an officer giving a report, but like a son telling the truth for the first time. "My mother, Margaret James, is deaf," he said. "For years, I watched the world grow less and less willing to include her. Even I let that silence stretch too long. A pause, brief but full. Until someone changed that, not with a title, not with rank, but with kindness." The audience had grown completely still now, every glass frozen midair, every head turned forward. Lily, standing discreetly at the back near the kitchen entrance, froze as well. Her hands gripped the folded napkin she'd been carrying, her heart hammering against her ribs. He couldn't be talking about her. Could he? Otero continued. "3 days ago, a young woman, someone working here at the Polaris Club, signed to my mother. Not because she had to. Not because it was expected. But because she saw her." His voice softened, and even from the back of the room, Lily could see the flicker of emotion cross his usually impenetrable face. "She reminded me of a language I'd forgotten," he said. "And in doing so, she gave me back my mother." Now, several officers in the front rows had turned to look around, silently wondering who this person was. "Her name is Lily Parker," Otero said, turning slightly toward her. "And I'd like her to join me." Lily's breath caught, and she felt the air leave her lungs like a tide pulling away from the shore. Someone touched her shoulder lightly, nodding her forward. Slowly, hands shaking, pulse racing, she walked through the sea of dress whites and gold braids, each step echoing louder than the last. As she stepped onto the platform, Admiral Otero met her with a small but unmistakably proud nod. He waited until she stood beside him, then turned back to the microphone. "Today, I'm issuing a new directive," he said. "Beginning this quarter, every staff member at the Polaris Club, from front desk to kitchen, will receive certified sign language training. Not just for efficiency, for empathy." A low wave of applause rose through the crowd, tentative at first, then fuller. He held up a hand for quiet, then continued. "But that's not all. I'm also announcing the creation of the James Parker Foundation, named in honor of my mother and this remarkable young woman." Lily's breath caught again. "The foundation's first act," he said, turning to look at her, "is awarding a full academic scholarship to Miss Parker to pursue a degree in speech and hearing sciences." Gasps filled the room, not for drama, but because hearts were cracking open all at once. Lily brought a hand to her chest, eyes wide, her lips trembling as she turned to the Admiral. He leaned in, speaking softly so only she could hear. "You don't serve with a tray. You serve with your hands. Let the world see them." She couldn't respond, not yet. The applause was rising now, building like a tide rolling in with all its weight and welcome. Several officers stood. Then more. Then all. In the span of moments, the room had transformed not into a celebration of formality, but of something quieter. Something human. As Lily stepped back, tears in her eyes, she noticed Margaret standing near the banquet's edge, dressed in a pale green gown again, a smile so wide it glowed from across the room. She raised her hands and signed across the space, "You belong here." Lily nodded, overwhelmed, her fingers signing back, "So do you." What happened next wasn't part of any program. A younger lieutenant seated in the front row stood and signed "Thank you" in shaky fingers. Another officer followed. Then a civilian staff member. One by one, hands rose not to salute, but to speak in the language of those who had waited too long to be heard. Later that evening, someone, no one knew exactly who, posted a photo online. It showed Lily standing beside Admiral Otero, the pendant around her neck catching the light, her hands mid-sign. The caption was simple: "She spoke without a sound." And the world finally listened. Within 24 hours, the post had gone viral. News outlets picked it up. "Waitress teaches Admiral a lesson in humanity," one headline read. Another, "She didn't wear a uniform, but she served anyway." Messages flooded in from veterans' families, from speech therapists, from people who had waited years for someone to notice them in silence. The story reached corners no military order ever had. But Lily wasn't thinking about virality. She was thinking about a boy named Eli who once tapped her shoulder when words failed him. A grandfather who taught her that listening had little to do with ears. And a woman named Margaret who found her voice again across a linen-covered table. The scholarship would change her future. The attention might change her life. But what mattered most wasn't what she'd received. It was what had been restored between a mother and a son, between silence and sound, between one girl's quiet courage and a room full of hearts that had forgotten how to listen. Sometimes the smallest voices start the loudest echoes. Who in your life has helped you feel seen without needing to say a word? Tell us in the comments, and if this story moved you, subscribe to the channel for more stories that show how even a whisper of compassion can change everything. The rain had returned, steady and unhurried, painting the streets with silver reflections that trembled beneath the glow of streetlights. Lily walked home with her coat pulled tight around her shoulders, the pendant resting against her chest, warm from touch rather than temperature. The city hummed faintly, cars splashing through puddles, distant laughter spilling from doorways, but somehow, she felt cocooned from it all. Her mind was still tangled in the echoes of the banquet, in the faces that had turned toward her with something she'd never been given before: recognition. For the first time in a long while, the world had heard her, and it hadn't turned away. 2 days later, her shift began as usual, quiet and organized, until the front desk manager called her name. "Lily, there's mail for you," she said, handing over a small bundle of envelopes tied with a thin blue ribbon. Lily frowned in surprise. She never received letters, certainly not at work. She carried the bundle into the break room, setting it carefully beside her tea before untying the ribbon. The first envelope was cream-colored, the handwriting elegant and looping, the kind that belonged to another era. "Dear Miss Parker," it began, "I'm the widow of a Navy veteran who lost his hearing in service. For years, my husband stopped attending public events because no one tried to communicate with him. But after reading about you, I cried because I realized that somewhere, kindness is still speaking." Lily's hand trembled as she continued reading, the ink slightly smudged from where the writer's tears must have fallen. "You made me wish my husband were still here to see it. Thank you for reminding me that people like him, like us, still matter." The letter ended simply, "With love and pride, Eleanor Briggs." Lily set it down, pressing her hand over her heart. For a moment, the room felt smaller, filled not with walls, but with warmth. She took a deep breath, wiping her eyes before opening the next envelope. This one was written by a young woman, a teacher, who said she had started learning sign language with her students after seeing Lily's story online. By the third letter, her tears had returned, soft but unstoppable. Some were from veterans' families, some from parents of deaf children, and others from people who had never experienced hearing loss at all, only loneliness. They wrote about courage, about connection, about the small, human gestures that break invisible barriers. "You didn't just sign to one person," one message said. "You signed to all of us who've ever felt unseen." Each word folded itself neatly into her heart until she could hardly breathe from the weight of gratitude. It wasn't just letters. Social media posts flooded in, photos and videos of people learning basic signs, of veterans holding placards that read "Thank you, Lily Parker." The Polaris Club phone rang constantly with press inquiries and requests for interviews, all of which she gently declined. She hadn't done it for attention, and the thought of cameras made her uneasy. What mattered was that people were learning to look up, to see each other again. Late one afternoon, as Lily finished stacking clean glasses at the bar, another envelope appeared, placed quietly on the counter by the front desk clerk. It was smaller, older, sealed with neat precision. She recognized the handwriting instantly, delicate, precise, familiar. She opened it carefully, unfolding the note written on lined stationery in soft blue ink. It read, "You reminded me I belong in this world again." It was signed, in firm script, Margaret James. Lily read it twice, then again, her fingers brushing the words as if they might fade if she let go. Margaret had written it herself, not typed, not dictated. Every curve of every letter carried her effort, her intent, her gratitude. It wasn't just a message, it was a restoration. Lily pressed the paper against her chest, eyes closing as she let the moment settle in her soul like a lullaby. That night, she left the club after closing, the rain starting again in soft, rhythmic drops. The streetlights reflected off the wet pavement like broken stars, and her shoes splashed through puddles that no longer felt cold. The pendant rested against her heart, its weight now familiar, its meaning deeper. She no longer walked with her eyes down. For the first time in years, her steps matched the rhythm of her heartbeat, steady, certain, and full of quiet purpose. As she neared the corner, she looked up to see the large banner now hanging just outside the Polaris Club entrance. It read, in elegant navy letters, "Voices that sign." Beneath it was a framed photograph, her photograph, capturing the moment she had stood beside Admiral Otero, hands mid-sign, light touching her face. Beneath it, a small inscription read, "In honor of those who listen without words." She stopped for a moment, rain sliding down her cheeks like the gentlest applause. She hadn't known they'd done this. Her throat tightened, her breath catching as she read it again and again, letting the reality sink in. She wasn't invisible anymore. Her story, their story, now lived on a wall built not for prestige, but for remembrance. Inside the club, she could see faint reflections of the dining room lights and silhouettes of people still talking, laughing, connecting. It looked warmer now, brighter somehow, as if kindness itself had taken root in the walls. Lily smiled, lifting a hand to sign a small thank you toward the building before turning toward home. The world wasn't quieter tonight. It was alive, and for once, it spoke her language. As she walked, the wind picked up just enough to rustle the pendant against her blouse. The metal glinted under the lamplight, its inscription catching her eye once more, "To the waves that hold us all." She smiled, realizing how far those waves had carried her from the silence of grief to the soundless music of belonging. For every act of compassion, every sign, every letter, she knew she'd been part of something much greater than herself. The current had found her, and she was finally moving with it, not against it. When she reached her apartment, she set Margaret's letter on her bedside table, beside her grandfather's old photograph. The two seemed to belong together, different lives, same message. She traced her fingers across both before turning off the lamp, the room bathed in the soft glow of city lights through rain-streaked glass. Sleep came easily that night, gentle as the tide, carrying her into dreams where silence was never empty, only full of what love leaves behind. The doors to the Polaris Club swung open with the same quiet elegance as always, but something felt different now. Lily stepped inside and paused for a moment, letting the familiar scent of polished wood and fresh linen wrap around her like an old song. Staff moved with grace through the grand hallway, but now, as she passed them, she noticed something new. A young hostess glanced up, smiled, and signed slowly, "Welcome back." Lily's heart caught gently in her chest, not from surprise, but from pride. Another server passed by, hands full of crystal, but raised a thumb and signed "Good morning" with his free hand. It wasn't perfect, not fluid yet, but it was trying. That was what mattered. That people who had once looked past her were now learning to look into her world. Each sign she saw wasn't just a gesture, it was a doorway opening wider. She made her way through the softly lit dining hall, the pendant beneath her blouse resting against her chest like a compass pointing inward. The grand piano sat unused in the corner, its lid dusted with fresh polish, waiting for music to return. Lily scanned the room, not as a server, but as a guest, or maybe something more. Her shoes tapped gently against the floor, echoing not like steps, but like rhythm. Then, at her usual table near the window, she saw her. Margaret James sat poised in a seafoam green blouse, her silver hair pulled back in a soft bun, her hands already moving before Lily reached her. Across the room, she signed, "Good to see you, dear." Lily smiled, her eyes crinkling with familiarity and warmth. She signed back, "Always a joy." The space between them felt stitched with memory, and something deeper than that, belonging. As Lily approached the table, Margaret rose slightly, taking both of her hands in greeting. They didn't speak, not out loud. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer absence, it was a language of its own. One shaped by gestures and grief and grace. Margaret gestured to the seat across from her, and Lily slid into it, feeling a peace settle into her bones. The waiter approached, notepad in hand, and signed clumsily, "Drink." Margaret beamed. "He's been practicing," she signed to Lily. Lily laughed, replying, "He's doing great." As they settled into conversation, about the weather, about the garden Margaret was tending again, a shadow appeared at the edge of the table. Lily looked up and saw Admiral Otero standing there. No medals today, no cap, no pretense. He wore a simple navy jacket over a collared shirt, his expression calm, his presence softer. "May I join you?" he asked. Margaret waved him toward the third chair, signing to Lily, "He doesn't know it, but I already ordered his tea." Lily stifled a smile as he sat down. "I heard that," he muttered playfully, watching her hands. Margaret just grinned, sipping her tea like she'd just won a chess match no one else knew they were playing. After a moment, Admiral Otero turned his gaze to Lily, steady but changed. "The Navy taught me how to lead," he said. "But you," he paused, not for drama, but to study the truth in his voice. "You taught me how to listen." Lily met his eyes, her chest full of emotion that didn't need to spill. She simply nodded, not because she lacked words, but because sometimes understanding was enough. They sat there, the three of them, sipping tea in the quiet rhythm of shared memory. Conversations flickered around them, but this table needed no attention to feel alive. There was something sacred in the ordinariness of it, the way healing had become part of routine. Margaret smiled at a nearby guest and waved. The woman waved back, then signed, "Nice to see you." And just like that, the silence of the world got smaller. When the meal was done and the conversation slowly faded into contentment, Lily stood and excused herself to the restroom. She walked through the hallway lined with new photographs, one of which now bore her name beside Margaret's and Otero's, a moment captured, but still breathing. In the mirror above the sink, she caught her reflection and paused. The girl she saw no longer looked uncertain, no longer carried herself like someone trying not to be seen. Her posture was still soft, but her presence was unmistakable. She leaned forward slightly, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, eyes fixed on her own. The pendant glinted faintly beneath the collar of her blouse, a silent weight that grounded her. She thought of her grandfather's fingers shaping bedtime stories, of Eli tugging at her hand to get her attention, of Margaret's laughter the first time someone signed to her in years. She thought of the Admiral's voice, stripped of command, offering the one thing he hadn't been able to say for decades, "Thank you." And as she stood there, alone but not lonely, Lily finally saw what everyone else had been trying to show her. She was never just a waitress. She was a connector, a translator, a keeper of memory and bridge between silences. She didn't just serve tea. She served something deeper, the feeling of being heard without having to speak. She smiled into the mirror, not out of pride, but out of quiet knowing. It had taken years, losses, and 1,000 small kindnesses to arrive at this moment. But she was here now, fully present, fully seen. And as she walked back toward the dining room, where two people waited who no longer felt like strangers, her hands brushed the edge of the pendant once more, not to check if it was there, but to remind herself what it stood for. In a world built on orders and medals, one silent gesture did what none of them could. It made someone feel truly heard. Thank you for listening to this story until the very end. There's another interesting one on your left screen that I think you'll really enjoy.